It is my great pleasure to be here. Now let me share my screen here. Share and actually go back to that. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was announced to the world by the Yale University News Bureau and simultaneously by the Yale Daily on April 10th, 1948. The announcement was written by Millar Burrows, professor of Old Testament at Yale Divinity School, who was also director of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. Now, any of you who are around Yale Divinity School and notice the pictures of former professors hanging on the wall may at some point have noticed Millar Burrows there. He was, I am told, known to his students as Rocky because he was interested in archaeology. But he became one of the really founding scholars in the scholarship on the Dead Sea Scrolls. The announcement mentioned 4 manuscripts: a copy of the book of Isaiah, a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, a manual of discipline of a little-known sect or religious order, possibly the Essenes, and a 4th that was not yet identified. It was later identified as a paraphrase of the book of Genesis, known as the Genesis Apocryphon. The first 3 of these scrolls had been found by a Bedouin, Muhammad ed-Dib, or the Wolf, who brought them to Bethlehem to a cobbler known as Kando. They took them to a cobbler because they figured this was leather. Although it was not at this point leather that would be of much use in shoes. This was one lucky cobbler, because he then became the middleman for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in fact, his family is still in the business today. 4 more scrolls were found in early summer of 1947. 3 of these, a second copy of Isaiah, the War Scroll, a manual for an apocalyptic battle between the forces of light and darkness, and the Hodayot, or Thanksgiving hymns, were acquired by Eliezer Sukenik, an Israeli scholar at the Hebrew University. So these ones actually then were always in Jerusalem. These are the ones, if you go to Jerusalem and go to the Shrine of the Book, these are the scrolls that you will see displayed. The 4th was the manuscript later identified as the Genesis Apocryphon. Burrows wasn't aware of the manuscripts that Sukenik had obtained. So he wasn't aware of the full extent of the discovery when he issued the press release. The great bulk of the scrolls, however, were not discovered until 1952. The initial scrolls are believed to have been found in a cave near the northern end of the Dead Sea. Now, you can see here, Jerusalem is about a half-hour drive away. Now, how long it would have taken to walk it in that climate, I'm not at all sure, but you know, it isn't a huge distance from Jerusalem. Cave 1 was here about 1 kilometer north of what were later identified as the ruins at Qumran. There were ruins known as Khirbet Qumran, about 3/4 of a mile south of that cave, a little less than a mile west of the Dead Sea. It was not immediately obvious that the scrolls were related to the site. Only at the end of 1951 were soundings made at the site. These brought to light pottery similar to that which was found in the cave. At that point, the excavation of the site of Qumran was undertaken under the direction of a Dominican priest, Roland de Vaux. De Vaux had fought in the French resistance in World War II, and by all accounts, he was quite a character. We'll touch maybe more next week on allegations that the Vatican suppressed things about the Dead Sea Scrolls because of the number of priests involved. Nobody who knew DeVoe would take any of that seriously. This was not a man to be messed with. Now, the excavations then continued until 1954, ending up with a site like this. Now, I'm not planning, unless somebody asks me, to talk much about the site, but you can see this was a watchtower. There was an elaborate water system. There were several pools with steps like those and this. So, there may have been some kind of an industrial establishment there. After all, people had to make a living. But it seems to be a community structure. Now, the publication, the main find of scrolls was out here in Cave 4, what became known as Cave 4. Fragments of about 800 manuscripts were found there. It became the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle to try to put these back together. As you can see, you couldn't really get to Cave 4 without going through this settlement. So there had to be a connection between them. There is another slide here of Cave 4, but it's maybe more significant to notice where it is in relation to this settlement. Further discoveries then were made in various caves in the region up to 1956. The publication of these scrolls is a story in its own right. The initial discovery took place on the eve of the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. When Palestine was divided, Qumran was in Jordanian territory, and this remained the case until 1967. And at that point, the Israeli army went in. And we will see in a minute, when the Israeli army went in, I showed you a picture of Eliezer Zukenik. Well, Zukenik's son was named Jigal Yadin, and he was a general in the Israeli army. And he had an interest in Dead Sea Scrolls. So he paid a visit to Kando, the cobbler, and took up his floorboards and found a very important scroll there, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But now the Jordanians, while they were in charge of the area, did not want any Jewish scholars on the team working on the scrolls, and this became very contentious. The manuscripts from Cave 1 were in good condition and were published promptly, but publication of the fragmentary manuscripts from Cave 4 proceeded at a glacial pace. Sorry, no, I'm getting ahead of myself there, sorry. Yeah. There were fanciful allegations of suppression of evidence by the Vatican, and we'll hear more of those next week. But but the simple fact was that the editorial team wasn't big enough to get the job done. There were growing protests at the delay, and these resulted in a major overhaul of the editorial team in 1991 to 92. An Israeli scholar, Emmanuel Tov, was put in charge of the operation. He greatly expanded the team of scholars and essentially completed the operation in about 10 years, which was a remarkable achievement. In all, fragments of close to 1,000 manuscripts were found in the desert close to the Dead Sea. Most of these manuscripts were in Hebrew. Some are in Aramaic. A few are in Greek. The site of Qumran was destroyed by the Romans in 68 of the Common Era. So all the manuscripts are presumably older than that. A few may be as early as the 3rd century BCE. The great bulk of the manuscripts date from the last century, or the last century before Christ, or the early 1st century. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest biblical manuscripts dated from the 9th or 10th century. Actually, from the very end of around 900. This is part of the Leningrad Codex, which I'll come back to in a minute. But now this, as I say, dates from about 900 AD. We had no manuscripts of the Bible in Hebrew older than that before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you can see why this was exciting. Very little literature from the period between the Bible and the Mishnah. That is to say, from the mid-2nd century BCE to 200 of the Common Era, had been preserved in Hebrew or Aramaic. Even works like for the first book of Maccabees, which was certainly composed in Hebrew, was only preserved in Greek translation. So the scrolls then opened a window on a dark period of Jewish literary history, which also happened to be the period when Christianity was born. Now, the scrolls can be divided into 3 categories. First are the texts that we know as the Hebrew Bible. Fragments of more than 200 biblical manuscripts were found at Qumran. Obviously, these were not all different books, but they were representing all the books of the Hebrew Bible except Esther and Nehemiah. And if you count Ezra and Nehemiah as one book, you can say except for the book of Esther. Second are books that clearly derive from a sectarian movement that have a particular ideology. These include 2 rule books for associations that were distinct but closely related. Third are books that are neither biblical nor clearly sectarian, and which are representative of Jewish literature at the time. Now, of course, the biblical books were also representative of Jewish literature at the time. Now, tonight I will speak of the biblical books and then at more length about the sectarian books. We will not get around to the kind of common Jewish books, although these 2 are important and we are coming more and more to appreciate their importance. So first then, the scrolls and the Bible. Before the discovery of the scrolls, there were 3 main witnesses to the text of the Hebrew Bible. Most translations were and continue to be based on what is known as the Masoretic text of the Bible, and that's what you have here in the Leningrad Codex. The Masoretes were Jewish scribes and scholars, based primarily in the cities of Jerusalem, Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, and Babylon in the 7th to 11th centuries of the Common Era. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, was preserved in a distinct form by the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritan text was generally regarded as an inferior variant of the Masoretic text. It expands the text in some places and harmonizes passages that disagree. Its most distinctive feature is that it claims that God chose Mount Gerizim, the holy mountain of the Samaritans, as the place for his name to dwell rather than Jerusalem. The third major witness is the Greek, known as the Septuagint because of the legend that it had been translated by 72 elders at the request of King Ptolemy II. The original Septuagint translation only included the Pentateuch, but the name became attached to the entire Greek Old Testament. This translation was preserved in manuscripts from the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, which were older than the Masoretic Hebrew text by several centuries. Older forms of the Greek text were occasionally discovered in papyri or detected in the New Testament. The discoveries at Qumran show that while the Masoretic form of the text was indeed old, Hebrew texts corresponding to the Samaritan Pentateuch and to the Septuagint were also in circulation in the time of Christ. A manuscript of Exodus dated to the middle of the 1st century before Christ by its style of writing consistently preserves the expansions beyond the MT, the Masoretic text, that are known from the Samaritan Pentateuch, but it doesn't contain the specifically Samaritan commandment to build an altar on Mount Gerizim. This suggests that the Samaritan Pentateuch was based on a text that also circulated among the Jews, that all the Samaritans did was change the name of the holy mountain. A manuscript of the Book of Numbers is similar. The scrolls also include Hebrew texts of some books that correspond to the Septuagint or the Greek rather than the Hebrew, rather than the traditional Hebrew. A text of the Book of Samuel found in 3 scrolls consistently agrees with the Greek where it differs from the Masoretic text. The Greek text of Jeremiah is shorter than the Hebrew by about 1/8. Before the discovery of the scrolls, it was thought that the translators had abbreviated the book. The book text of the Book of Job is also much shorter in Greek. Now, Hebrew poetry is very repetitive. You tend to say the same thing over again in a number of different ways. And so people thought that the Greek translators said enough of this and just abbreviated it. But this does not seem now to be the case. It seems that in fact the Greek translation was based on a Hebrew text, and quite probably on a Hebrew text that was older than the one that is now found in the Hebrew Bible. While most of the texts that we know as biblical are found at Qumran, it would be anachronistic to speak of a biblical canon. The Torah or Pentateuch was certainly authoritative. It seems, however, that while the books were authoritative, the text could vary. We might compare the way different translations of the Bible are viewed in modern times. It actually makes a difference whether you read the New Revised Standard Version or the Good News Bible. Now, admittedly, these are still supposed to be translations of the same thing. But in antiquity, it seems that you could have a longer text of Exodus or a shorter text of Exodus, and that, this was okay. Much the same way that people are not bothered by different translations nowadays. Now, in the 1st century of the Common Era, there seems to have been an attempt to standardize the text, but only in the 1st century of the Common Era. So in the time of Jesus, there would have been different forms of the text in circulation. The fluidity of the biblical text is related to another phenomenon in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that of rewritten scripture or biblical paraphrase. The Genesis Apocryphon, one of the first manuscripts found at Qumran, is a good example. These paraphrases were not just attempts to summarize the text, they also attempted to resolve problems in the text and to introduce ideas that the scribes thought were implied. In some cases, it is difficult to be sure whether the scribes intended to supplement the received text or to replace it. The label 4Q Reworked Pentateuch refers to 5 fragmentary manuscripts that were originally thought to be part of the same text, but are now regarded as separate compositions. All 5 expand the text of the Masoretic text in a way similar to what we find in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Increasingly, scholars have come to regard these texts not as paraphrases, but as new editions of the biblical text. An even more problematic case. Where am I here? Yes, is this one, the Temple Scroll. Well, this now actually was the scroll that Yadin found under Kando's floorboards in 1967. It was the longest scroll found at Qumran, longer than the book of Isaiah. It was a paraphrase of part of the Torah designed apparently to harmonize the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Now, I think most Christians go through life happily not noticing differences in the biblical text. But if you read them closely, they're often quite different. I mean, different passages contradict each other. This is also true in the Gospels, and people tend to ignore that too. But now these people were trying to harmonize those differences. And the striking thing about the Temple Scroll is that it is presented as the speech of God in the first person. So you figure they must have meant this to be authoritative. If you attribute something to God, what higher authority can you invoke? Now, for a long time, people thought that this was perhaps the Torah of Qumran or the Bible of Qumran, but that doesn't seem to be the case, because whenever the Torah is cited, it's cited in the traditional form, the form that we have in the Masoretic Bible. So citations of the Torah and the scrolls generally follow the traditional Torah. If the authors of the Temple Scroll hoped that it would replace the traditional Torah, they were disappointed. But nonetheless, several copies of it were made and preserved at Qumran. Now, the important point in all of this is that as late as the time of Christ, scribes were still tinkering with the Torah. If you were copying the Torah and you thought you could improve on it a little bit here and there, you could do it. And scribes did that. So it was really only in the century after Christ that they began to clamp down on that and fix the actual text of the Bible. Okay. Turning then to the sectarian movement. The initial announcement of the scrolls by Millar Burrows noted that one of the manuscripts seemed to be a manual of discipline for a sect or religious order. He took the phrase, a manual of discipline, apparently from the Methodist Church. I am not familiar with it otherwise. This text eventually became known as the Community Rule, or in Hebrew, Serek HaYachad. And where are we here? This is the Community Rule. If it were a little bit bigger on the screen, you could see it's actually written beautifully and very legible. Not at all difficult to make out. In its core, it included regulations for admission to this community or association. It involved a process of postulancy. It was a 3-year process to be admitted, and then rules for a common life, which went down into great detail on occasion. For example, there were penalties prescribed if somebody fell asleep during a lecture, or if somebody guffawed inappropriately, or wasn't properly dressed. So notably, it required that all possessions be shared. Also remarkably, it never mentions women or children. Just doesn't mention them at all. Burrows had already suggested that the sect in question was possibly the Essenes, who are known from accounts in the historian Josephus, the philosopher Philo, and the Roman author Pliny. Now, that's Pliny's account. I'm not sure if it's legible to you or not. But Pliny notes that the Essenes had a settlement on the shore of the Dead Sea between Jericho and En Gedi. He says that they lived without women and without money. Philo and Josephus also say that the Essenes were celibate, that they didn't marry. But Josephus qualifies this and says that one branch of the Essenes did marry. Josephus gives an account of the admission procedures that is strikingly similar to what is found in the community rule. The identification of the movement or sect was complicated by the discovery of another rule book a few years later, known as the Damascus Document. Actually, the Damascus Document was already known. It had been found in the Cairo Geniza in 1897. And once the scrolls were found, it was obvious that there was some relationship between them. Then several copies of the Damascus Rule were found at Qumran in K4. It's called the Damascus Document because it refers to a new covenant in the land of Damascus. Now, very few people think that actually means that it was a covenant made in Damascus. Damascus is probably a symbolic name for a place of exile, possibly Qumran, but not necessarily. The Damascus Document envisioned a new covenant which people could enter by swearing an oath to observe the Mosaic law as it was interpreted in this group. It was a family-based movement. People could marry and live in camps according to the order of the land, and marry and have children. Members contributed 2 days' salary per month to a common fund, but not all their possessions, as was required by the community rule. Most scholars, with a few exceptions, think that the Damascus Document reflects the earlier stage of the movement. At some point, that would mean that it started out as a family-based movement, where people married and had families, and then joined this movement by swearing an oath. At some point, it was decided to establish a more strictly separatist movement, to aim for a higher degree of holiness. The community rule speaks of a special group set apart within the community, who were to go into the desert to prepare the way of the Lord. This is the passage. By studying the Torah. Most scholars assume that this referred to the establishment of a community at Qumran in the desert, where the scrolls were found. This may be correct, but Qumran was evidently not the only sectarian settlement. Column 6 of the community rule clearly provides for multiple settlements with a quorum of 10 members. Both Philo and Josephus also say that the Essenes were not confined to one settlement, but were dispersed throughout the land. Most scholars accept the Essene hypothesis. The correspondences between the community rule and the accounts of the Essenes, especially that of Josephus, are striking. They are not exact in all details. The most controversial point has concerned the alleged celibacy of the Essenes. The community rule does not require celibacy, but neither does it mention women or children. Some people argue that if you want people to be celibate, you had better tell them that it's not something that could be taken for granted. But it is also remarkable that a rule book that is greatly concerned with purity should not mention women at all, whereas the Damascus rule has no trouble mentioning women and children. Many scholars think that the Damascus Document and the community rule represent the two branches of the Essene movement mentioned by Josephus, one of which married. A few female skeletons were found in the cemetery at Qumran, but it is now increasingly recognized that the site of Qumran is not necessarily definitive for the makeup of the movement. For a long time, scholars believed that the sectarian movement had its origin in a dispute over the high priesthood in the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. This was a turbulent period in Judea, as we know from the books of Maccabees. During the reign of the Syrian or Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes, beginning in 175 BCE, the traditional high priest in Jerusalem was replaced, initially by his brother Jason. Subsequently, Jason was also replaced by a man named Menelaus. The legitimate high priest, Onias III, was murdered, and his son fled to Egypt, where he entered the military service of the Ptolemy and built his own temple at a place called Leontopolis. Fighting between Jason and Menelaus led to intervention of the Syrians in Jerusalem, which in turn led to the Maccabean revolt. Eventually, when the revolt succeeded, Jonathan Maccabee assumed the high priesthood, and it remained in the Maccabean family, known as the Hasmoneans, for nearly a century. For a long time, scholars assumed that the movement described in the scrolls arose in response to those events. The traditional priestly line in Jerusalem was thought to be descended from Zadok from the time of David and Solomon. The people who settled at Qumran were thought to be Zadokite priests. The Zadokite hypothesis rested on 4 pillars, all of which have come to be questioned. First, the Damascus Document says that the movement had its origin 390 years after the Babylonian exile. This figure corresponds to a passage in the book of Ezekiel, which says that Israel would bear its punishment for 390 years. Taken literally, this would point to a date of 196 BCE. Scholars realized it shouldn't be taken literally because it's a biblical allusion, but they still took it as approximately correct. It's doubtful, however, whether it can be used for dating at all. Jews in the 2nd century BC did not have any information as to how much time had passed since the Babylonian exile. And this is clear even in the historian Josephus. He just did not know how long the Persian period had lasted. Second, both the Damascus Document and the Community Rule refer to, refer to the members of their movement as sons of Zadok. This label too is taken from Ezekiel, in this case from chapter 44, which says that the sons of Zadok are the elect of Israel, the men called by name. It appears that the sectarians called themselves sons of Zadok, not because they were descended from priests, but to indicate that they were the only faithful Israelites. Third, a commentary on the prophet Habakkuk alludes to a time of conflict between the sectarian leader called the teacher of righteousness and a figure called the wicked priest, which in Hebrew involves a pun on high priest. It is not apparent, however, that this was a dispute as to who should be high priest. The wicked priest is never said to be illegitimate. The identity of the wicked priest remains in dispute. Proponents of the Zadokite hypothesis usually identify him with Jonathan Maccabee, but all the other identifiable references in the commentary relate to events in the 1st century BCE, about 100 years later than Jonathan. Finally, the settlement at Qumran was often dated to the time of Jonathan Maccabee, but this was not required by the archaeological evidence, but was inferred from the Zadokite hypothesis itself. The texts themselves never say that the movement arose because of a dispute about the high priesthood. On the contrary, they say repeatedly that it arose because of disputes about the proper interpretation of the law. According to the Damascus Document, all Israel was caught in the 3 nets of Belial: fornication, riches, and profanation of the temple. The issue concerning fornication was the law of divorce. Most people thought it was permissible to divorce and remarry, but the sectarians insisted that it was forbidden to marry a second woman while the first was alive. The scrolls often complained about the acquisition of wealth by the ruling class. Profanation of the temple was due to failure to observe purity laws properly. The issues in dispute were spelled out in most detail in a text called 4QMMT, meaning Some of the Works of the Law. This text is addressed to a ruler of Israel, most probably the high priest. It contains a list of some 22 cases involving purity, where the sectarians disagreed with the current interpretation. A representative case, my favorite case, concerns the purity of liquid streams. If you have two cups, and the second one is the empty one is dirty, and you pour water into that cup, does the first one become unclean? Does the impurity travel upstream, so to speak? I had gone through life happily never worrying about that. But I have a son who is a scientist, and he tells me he worries about that kind of thing in the lab every day. So maybe they're onto something. But no, this is the kind of thing. You know, for the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was unthinkable that you would regard the first cup as pure. And if other people disagreed with you on that, you just couldn't live with those people. And they say, therefore, we have separated ourselves from the multitude of the people. Now, this text had been identified in the 1950s, but its significance hadn't been perceived. Now, for reasons that we'll talk about next week, in the early phase of the study of the scrolls, all the interest was in the things that corresponded to Christianity. And this was regarded as a proto-Mishnaic text and not very interesting. When it was finally brought to light in 1984, it caused a sensation because it seemed to give the explicit reason why this group broke away and formed their own association. And it had to do with the proper interpretation of the law. On all the points in question, they were stricter than their opponents. And they said that their opponents were seekers after smooth things. Now, many people think that the seekers after smooth things were the Pharisees. The Pharisees don't have the reputation of being softies or lax in the New Testament. But in the eyes of the people at Qumran, they were lax. These people were to the right of the Pharisees, much stricter in the interpretation of the law. Now, this kind of intense concern for the proper observance of the law that we find in 4QMMT reflects a change in Judaism after the Maccabean revolt. Now, you know, in most societies, I would say people take the law with a grain of salt. You know, law is good. It's important to have it. You'll observe the big ones, but not to the degree that you would wait for the traffic light if there was nobody coming. You know, you can give yourself a little bit of latitude in it. And I'd say that was typically the way the law was observed before the Maccabean revolt. But the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes tried to abolish that law completely. And so it became a matter of identity. And then for the Maccabees and their followers, it was absolutely important to keep all the details of the law. And it's after that, the great concern with purity begins to show up in the literature. And also you begin to find stepped pools for ritual immersion and stone vessels because they were easier to keep pure. Now, this in turn led to disputes about what was the correct interpretation of the law, and then divisions among groups like the Pharisees and the Essenes, which led to what we call sectarianism. For many centuries, The knowledge of Judaism in the time of Jesus was based on the rabbinic literature, which was written down hundreds of years later, although it may contain old traditions. Rabbinic Judaism was heavily focused on the Torah and its interpretation. It was widely believed that Torah interpretation was the basis of the weekly synagogue service, and that there was a kind of normative Judaism to which most people conformed. This picture began to be challenged in the 19th century. A Scottish traveller named James Bruce went to Ethiopia in the late 18th century and brought back 4 copies of the Book of Enoch, which was regarded as sacred scripture in Ethiopia. Enoch, as I'm sure you all know, was the 7th in line from Adam and lived before the flood. But he suddenly became productive around the 2nd century BC, and you get a spate of writings attributed to him. Now, the Book of Enoch contained 5 booklets of revelations supposedly given to Enoch before the flood. They depicted a very different universe from that of the rabbinic literature. It was peopled by angels and demons and contained descriptions of otherworldly cosmology, including the abodes of the dead. On the basis of this literature, scholars began to reconstruct a kind of Judaism that was very different from that of the rabbis. It attached much less importance to the Torah and more to special revelations about the heavenly world and life after death. This kind of literature was dubbed apocalyptic because of the similarity to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. In the course of the 19th century, several similar revelations or apocalypses came to light, mostly in the libraries of Christian monasteries, in such languages as Ethiopic, Syriac, and Old Church Slavonic. Typically, these writings were attributed to Old Testament figures, Enoch, Abraham, Isaiah, Ezra, Baruch, and contained few elements that were clearly Christian. The corpus of literature became known as pseudepigrapha, or falsely attributed writings, since the writings were obviously not composed by Enoch and his friends to whom they were attributed. Scholars came to regard them as Jewish compositions, even if they contained some interpolations by Christian scribes. Many of them were thought to have been composed in Hebrew or Aramaic, although some were written in Greek. In the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, a German scholar named Wilhelm Bousset wrote A Religion of Judaism, which was based primarily on these pseudepigraphic and apocalyptic writings. It was met with a storm of protest from Jewish scholars who believed that the rabbinic writings were the real Judaism. A great Christian scholar, George Foot Moore, joined the protest and proceeded to write a classic account of what he called normative Judaism, based on the rabbinic writings. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was no way to adjudicate this controversy for lack of primary evidence. As it turned out, fragments of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, as were Hebrew fragments of the Book of Jubilees, which was also preserved as scripture in Ethiopia. Moreover, the Hebrew scrolls that first came to light contained a view of the world that was very different from that of the rabbis. According to the community rule, when God created man to rule the world, he appointed 2 spirits for him to walk in, the spirits of truth and deceit. Those born of truth are from a fountain of light. Those born of deceit are from a source of darkness. The children of light are ruled by the angel of light, those of darkness by the angel of darkness. The text goes on to describe the ways of each spirit. In the end, the God of truth will intervene and destroy all the forces of darkness. The children of light will enjoy eternal life in garments of light. The children of darkness are condemned to dark, fiery regions. Another of the original batch of scrolls contained a manual for a decisive war between the children of light and the children of darkness. Each side would prevail alternately through 6 phases of the war. In the end, God would intervene. The forces of light would be led by the archangel Michael, and those of darkness by Belial, a prince of evil, better known as Satan in later tradition. Now, this dualism of light and darkness under God, which we find in these texts, had no parallel in older biblical tradition. Its closest parallel was in Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion. The scholar who first pointed this out was a Nazi sympathizer, K.G. Kuhn, and a lot of people weren't inclined to take it seriously for that reason. But in fact, his views were well-founded in the text. Before the discovery of the scrolls, however, no one was aware that such ideas had ever been entertained in ancient Judaism. In light of these clearly non-rabbinic aspects of the scrolls, the initial impression was that they supported Bousset's view of ancient Judaism. Frank Moore Cross, who is here, who was arguably the greatest Hebrew Bible scholar of the second half of the 20th century, argued that the Essenes were the carriers of the apocalyptic tradition. As we have already noted, the team of scholars working on the scrolls in the 1950s were all Christian. They naturally looked for elements in the scrolls that resonated with later Christianity, and they found plenty. There was, however, another aspect of the scrolls that would eventually emerge. The affinities with Rabbinic Judaism became evident first with the publication of the Temple Scroll in the 1980s, but even more with the publication of 4QMMT, which was first presented to the public in 1984. From these texts, it became apparent that the sectarian movement behind the Dead Sea Scrolls was intensely concerned with Jewish law, just as the rabbis were later. In effect, the scrolls showed that both Bousset and Moore were right. Some Jews in the late Second Temple period were already focused intensely on the law. Others were more concerned with heavenly revelations and with the fate of individuals after death. Judaism in the Second Temple period was different from that of the rabbis, but it wasn't entirely different. The kinds of concerns that would later emerge were already present before the turn of the era. The concern for the law in the scrolls is nonetheless distinctive. The sectarians believed that God had revealed to them the hidden things in which all Israel had gone astray. He unfolded before them his holy Sabbaths and his glorious feasts, the testimonies of his righteousness and the ways of his truth, the desires of his will which a man must do in order to live. The basic law was revealed to all Israel, but its correct interpretation was not. It was not enough to observe the law as best one could. It was necessary to understand it correctly, and this correct interpretation was only revealed to the members of the new covenant. According to the community rule, in every community with a minimum of 10 members, there must always be a man studying the law day and night, and the community was supposed to study it together for 1/3 of every night of the year. The new revelations about the interpretation of the law were presumably the fruit of these nightly sessions. So the sectarian movement known from the scrolls was certainly focused on the law of Moses. Nonetheless, the initial sense that it was an apocalyptic movement was not without foundation. It is not just a matter of the dualism of light and darkness, which in fact only shows up in a few texts, but more generally, the sectarians believed they were living in the last period of history, the end of days, when prophecy was being fulfilled. The end had already begun, but some important events were still to come, most notably the coming of the Messiah, or more properly, of two Messiahs, a royal Messiah and a priestly Messiah. I'll talk more about messianism or messianic expectation next week. The sectarian movement of the scrolls, unlike the early Christian movement, did not involve the cult of a messianic figure. The Messiah was mainly an agent who was to clear the way for the proper restoration of the temple cult. Some people have speculated that the teacher of righteousness was a Messiah, but he's never called that, and he doesn't actually do any of the things that a Messiah was supposed to do. Now, I'll pass over that when we'll come back to it next week. The last point that I want to mention as a distinctive thing in these sectarian scrolls is their attitude to life after death. According to Josephus, the Essenes did not believe in resurrection of the body, but did believe in the immortality of the soul. The evidence of the scrolls on this is disputed. Some texts that clearly envision resurrection, such as the biblical book of Daniel, are found at Qumran, but the sectarian texts, the distinctively sectarian texts, are ambiguous. Typical is the statement in the Treatise on the Two Spirits, which talks about everlasting blessing and eternal joy in life without end, a crown of glory and a garment of majesty in unending light. This may not be the Platonic idea of the immortality of the soul, but it is a form of afterlife that does not require a body of flesh and blood. Also typical are passages in the Thanksgiving hymn, of which I give you two samples here. I walk on limitless level ground, and I know that there is hope for him whom you have shaped from dust for the everlasting counsel. You have cleansed a perverse spirit of great sin, that it may stand with the host of the holy ones and may enter into community with the congregation of the sons of heaven. The holy ones and the sons of heaven were the angels. And these people, or some segment of them, evidently believed that they were already living with the angels. Now, there was a big cemetery beside the settlement at Qumran with about 1,000 graves. They were not unaware of death, but they never talk about it in any of the sectarian texts. They never acknowledge it as a problem. They seem to think that they had already passed from death to life, so to speak, and that they would just continue on with the angels. Now, I don't think it is necessarily the case that all members of the New Covenant thought that. I think actually in the community rule, when they talk about the group that is to go into the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord, this would be an elite group, a group that was aiming for a higher degree of holiness. And my suspicion is that these were also the people who were celibate. In the book of Enoch, God tells the fallen angels that you had it made, you were immortal, you would live forever. That's why I didn't give you women. You didn't need to procreate, so you didn't need women. Pardon the attitude, but this is the way they put it. And I think this was probably the attitude also with the elite holy people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they also thought they were living with the angels, they would live forever, and so they didn't need to marry and have children. One final point, you will often see the Dead Sea Scrolls referred to as the Library of Qumran. And that has been the common idea, that this was the library of the community that lived at the site. Now, I think it's very likely that there was some library there, but I think it is hard to believe that if you ever go to Qumran, it's a godforsaken place, and that they would have a library of 1,000 books or more. That boggles the mind. My own suspicion is that there was some library there, but that at the time of the Jewish war against Rome, the Essenes in other parts of the country took their scrolls and headed for the most remote settlement they knew of, and took the scrolls to hide them at Qumran. So there was probably some library, but I don't think it's correct to refer to the scrolls as the library of the settlement at Qumran.